Brennan Center for Justice event. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with New York University School of Law. I'm Taryn Merkel, Senior Counsel in the Justice Program and the Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration Initiative. I'm happy to be your moderator for today's unfortunately untimely event. We are grateful to our producing partner for this event, NYU's John Bradamus Center, which advocates for civil politics and public policy. I want to invite those listening to share your questions with our guests by typing them in our Q&A box and let us know where you're watching from. We will try to incorporate as many questions as we can during the course of the event. The United States' continuing practice of capital punishment increasingly makes us an outlier on the world stage. The nationwide decline in executions in recent years highlights the arbitrary nature of this punishment, an injustice that is heightened even further by the inherent racial disparities throughout our justice system. Our guest, Marshall Project staff writer Maurice Chammah, has written a new book to be published later this month about this controversial subject. It is called Let the Lord Sort Them: The Rise and Fall of the Death Penalty. In the book, Chammah takes a close look at capital punishment in Texas, long the country's leader of executions. In doing so, he casts a critical eye on the ultimate punishment and the United States' role in perpetuating mass incarceration. We'll put a link to the chat shortly, if it's not there already, on how to order the book, and I do recommend it. It's a very, very interesting read, especially for those of us who care deeply on this issue. So please welcome Maurice Chammah. Good afternoon, Maurice.
Hi there, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So just to lay the foundation, to sort of give us the land, can you help us understand the landscape of capital punishment in the United States? Since the Supreme Court's landmark ruling in 1972 that eventually ended the punishment for a period of time, we've seen a resurgence with approximately 2,500 people on state death rows and just over 50 people on federal death row and 3 federal executions scheduled for this week alone. We're talking about the rise and fall of the death penalty, but we're seeing a resurgence. What should we make of this?
It's interesting. So when I first started working on the book, it really seemed like the death penalty was on its way out. To jump back to the historical context, in the 1960s, the death penalty almost disappeared in America. It was disappearing in Europe and many other countries, and the Supreme Court ruled that all the state death penalty laws around the country violated the Constitution. There was a tremendous backlash to that, and states went and wrote new laws so that they could bring the punishment back. And what you see over the course of the 80s and 90s is an embrace of executions throughout the country, especially in the South, and even more especially in Texas, which is why I focus on Texas in the book. It was sort of the epicenter of the punishment. You get to the point where there are roughly 40 executions a year by the end of the 90s, around the turn of the millennium, hundreds of people being sentenced to death every year. And then you see the beginning of a fall, sort of after the beginning of the George W. Bush presidency. The number of people who are sentenced to death and executed year by year starts to sort of decline to the point where over the past several years, the numbers have been really quite small. You know, there have been, I think, other than these Trump federal executions, the number of state executions is, down into the between 10 and 20 a year, and Texas only sent like a few people, less than 10, to death row each of the last 2 years. And the point of the book was to try to understand the larger systemic reasons for this rise and fall. Why did we embrace the punishment so thoroughly over those years? What were the ways that prosecutors and judges and juries went about sentencing people to death? And then why has it disappeared since? Ironically, I think that the Trump executions, they seem like a very dramatic resurgence, and they are, insofar as this year we'll see, a kind of uptick in executions. But there hasn't been anything that suggests to me that the punishment writ large is really going to come back in a robust way. There will be individual presidents, individual governors who make it a priority and really try to carry out a lot of executions. But I actually think that these Trump executions have sort of galvanized opposition to the death penalty. They've shown to many members of the public just how unpopular the death penalty is. The details of the cases have really troubled, I think, a lot of people, even in the political center. And to me, the response to these executions has actually typified the sort of seismic political shift that we've seen over the last 20 years, to where these executions kind of seem like outliers in a presidency that is itself one in which lots of unprecedented, strange, and often terrible things happen. But I don't think that executions at the federal level or even in the states are going to sort of resurge as a result of what happened this week and over the past few months under Trump.
Thank you for that background. So often, the conversations about the death penalty feel somewhat abstract. Looking at individual cases, of course, puts some additional color on it. I was wondering if you could share with the audience the sort of history of the story with which you open your book in the prologue. It's the story of the first capital execution following the reinstatement of the death penalty in Texas in 1982, in Huntsville.
Yeah, that's right. So Texas was the first state to carry out a lethal injection. The Supreme Court very dramatically in 1976 said, we're reversing course. The death penalty, comports with the Constitution, and executions can start being carried out. A few states went about carrying them out. And then Texas in 1982 carried out the first lethal injection. It was of a man named Charlie Brooks. And I opened the book on the very sort of intimate story of a chaplain, a man who has been, conscripted to work for the prison system, usually as a kind of religious, spiritual advisor to men in prison. But he's taken aside by the warden of the main prison in Huntsville and told, we're going to start executing people again. And this chaplain, his name is Carroll Pickett, the Reverend Carroll Pickett, described to me the sort of sinking feeling in his stomach, the kind of sense of horror that this was going to come back. The last execution had happened, I think 16 years earlier. Nobody he was working with had been around back then. And so it seemed like this very sort of terrible, novel thing. Throughout the opening chapter of the book, I describe how he watches the executioners practice before the actual event. They do these sort of mock executions with a guard basically standing in the role of the condemned. And then the warden says to him, so your job, well, I should jump back and say the mock sort of condemned man, right, who's played by a guard, day by day sort of plays his role. And then one day he starts to fight and he says, no, I'm not going to go to my death. And he fights back, and the executioners have to strap him down very sort of violently. And they are all a little shaken by having done this. And then at that point, the warden goes to Pickett, the chaplain, and says, your job will be to seduce the prisoner's emotions. And that means, over the course of the day before the execution, I want you to get to know this man, be calm with him, be the sort of friendly face, and, help him get his sort of spiritual affairs in order. And Carroll Pickett has this really difficult moment where he, on the one hand, thinks I can be a comfort to these men before their death. But on the other hand, I'm a sort of cog in this machine to sort of make it happen smoothly, right? And his ambivalence, his sense of, moral quandary in doing that, I think speaks to the larger question of the death penalty and the way that we as a society tend to see it. There's a lot of ambivalence, even among people who say that they support the punishment. And then, the point of the book was to kind of give a really, really in-depth sense of what these different people who play some role around the death penalty go through as people. So from Carroll Pickett, we moved to the family members of Charlie Brooks, the man who was being executed, his sons who raced in their car from to Huntsville to try to get in to watch the execution, and in the nick of time get there and find out their father doesn't want them to see his death. I talk about the defense lawyers and the prosecutors in these cases, and then the family members of the murder victims who really reckon with this question of like, is this what we need? Is this justice to have our a life taken in exchange for the person in our family who was murdered? So the idea was to introduce the reader to all these different people, because the death penalty, like you say, can seem very abstract. It could also seem like it affects a very small number of people. I mean, there have been, roughly 1,500 executions in the US in the last 50 years. There have been thousands and thousands and thousands of murder cases, so this represents a tiny fraction. But I wanted people to understand that it sort of trickles out and affects a very, very large number of people over the course of decades of their lives as they sort of deal with the trauma of murder and then the trauma of the state coming in and taking a life in exchange.
So that ambivalence you describe and the moral quandary that the folks are tasked with carrying it out are forced to deal with, sort of harkens back to the idea that it is so rare and arbitrary. You've described it elsewhere in your other work as almost symbolic response to crime. Can you expand on that idea a little bit?
Sure. So the death penalty, I mean, I actually had some people who study the, Texas criminal justice system very closely and said to me, why are you focusing on the death penalty? It's such a small number of cases. The number of people, for example, who die in prison every year is actually greater than the number of people who are executed. But I have long felt that the death penalty is the sort of symbolic peak of our country's larger turn towards punitive crime policy. Now we sort of talk about mass incarceration and the idea that over the last 50 years, the US, sort of responded to crimes by saying, we need to punish this person, we need to put them in prison. We turned away from rehabilitation, from narratives of redemption, the idea that somebody could be sort of granted mercy after they commit a crime and rehabilitated and re-enter society. We started sentencing people to prison for 10 and 20 and 40 years for crimes that we had previously sent them, and in Europe, we're sending them for much less. And to me, I came to realize that the death penalty is the sort of symbolic pinnacle of that system, that when you allow executions of some prisoners, it makes a life sentence without the possibility of parole seem like a slightly more lenient option and not nearly as punitive as it might otherwise seem. And then, ratcheting down from there, every very severe punishment seems a little less severe because you have death at the very top of that system. It also trickles down insofar as it becomes a talking point for politicians. It's the way that they kind of telegraph toughness. I mean, even President-elect Joe Biden a generation ago was standing in front of the Senate and extolling the benefits of the death penalty and making jokes about how, I think he once said, I want a bill where we do everything but hang people for jaywalking, which seems like a very kind of macabre joke out of step with his current public persona, but it's part and parcel of just how much punitiveness had saturated our sort of national political culture a generation ago. And so I saw exploring the death penalty as a way of getting at how we as a country turned so strongly towards punitiveness writ large.
The sort of excessive punitiveness that you describe and the trickle-down effects of having the ultimate punishment on the table being a given for so long. Earlier in your remarks, you mentioned that we've sort of been seeing a seismic shift. Were you surprised in your research and in your analysis at the shift we're seeing? And can you expand on that idea a little more?
Sure. So one group of people that I became very fascinated by through the research and ended up doing sort of dozens of interviews with these people were defense lawyers who represent people on death row and people who are facing the death penalty, who are arrested for a capital crime. And in the early 90s, it turns out they were treated as sort of extremists in a way, that they were these sort of kind of kooky out there people who want to defend the worst of the worst and who were terribly out of step with our larger culture. A lot of them hid what they did. They would name their organizations things like the Texas Resource Center, which was sort of purposefully vague so no one would really understand what they did because they would otherwise get death threats and bomb threats for doing this work, right? But over time, they just sort of chipped away at the system. And the way they did that, there were many ways they did it, but one that fascinated me the most was that they would very vigorously investigate the life stories of the people they were defending. They would let's say that some of the dramatic examples like recount in the book involved defendants who were originally from Mexico, and they would go down to Mexico to the little town where their client, the defendant in the death penalty case, was raised, and they would interview people who had gone to elementary school with this person, their friends, their family, fourth cousins. I mean, just the sort of massive, massive pool of people. And then they would get every record of, a mental health institution, a school, a hospital, piecing together the sort of life of this person and trying to understand how they went from birth to committing the crime that they committed, right? There's been a very dramatic example of this in the news this week with the case of Lisa Montgomery, where on the one hand, her crime strikes most, I think, on first glance as uniquely horrible. She murdered a pregnant woman and took the fetus in a very violent way. But her defense lawyers have also gotten a narrative out there in public of this woman's life, the fact that she was repeatedly sexually assaulted as a child. She underwent severe trauma, brain injuries, severe mental illnesses, to the point where she was in prison and didn't even understand why she was in prison because her sense of, she disassociated from reality so dramatically. And that case sort of this week epitomizes this larger shift I saw, where defense lawyers sort of grew skilled in presenting these narratives of trauma, of sort of tremendous poverty to juries. And it wasn't to say we should excuse the crimes that these people committed or that this person, should never go to prison, but it was to get just enough mercy among the jurors that they would say, not the death penalty for this person. And over time, that has really had a big effect. I mean, it's had an effect in terms of the public conversation around these cases. And it's had an effect in the legal system where, case by case, they've just managed to convince judges and prosecutors and juries to spare these people. And overall, it has led to a very big shift away from the death penalty in ways that I think signal or comport with a larger turn away from mass incarceration. I mean, it was fascinating to me that the death penalty had gone into such decline, and it was sort of, I then saw that, President Trump, the president who was overseeing all these executions, signed the First Step Act. And the First Step Act was, of course, a bill that many people, of course, called attention to its flaws, but it symbolically said, we believe that people who go to prison shouldn't always be there for the rest of their lives and should have some opportunities for rehabilitation and to make a new start in life, that the person who committed the crime and the person who gets out of prison 20 years later isn't necessarily the same. And when after he signed that bill, he said in a State of the Union address, we are a country that believes in redemption. This is the same president who's overseeing executions. And we can, of course, call attention to the sort of contrast or conflict in Trump's, criminal justice policies. But even the fact that Trump was saying something about rehabilitation in a State of the Union address, to me, felt part of this larger shift and a suggestion that the kind of spade work that these defense attorneys were doing 20, 30 years ago really kind of paid off in the long term.
So that practice you're describing of really digging deep and doing those internal investigations and getting the information about each person, have you seen that trickle out beyond death penalty cases to impact the larger justice system as we incorporate better understandings of trauma and childhood trauma and intergenerational effects of trauma?
A little bit, little by little. And I'll say that the real barrier to it trickling out further is money. I mean, it's an expensive thing to do. And there are legal sort of Supreme Court jurisprudence reasons why defense teams in death penalty cases get the resources to go to Mexico and why there's a sort of attention and effort there. But in the case of sort of, a murder, a armed robbery, aggravated assault case, you're starting to see the public defender offices around the country sort of attend the trainings that these capital defense teams put on, sort of start to understand these larger systemic reasons why people commit violent crimes and incorporate them into their arguments to judges and juries. Like you say, often it has to do with trauma and the idea that somebody underwent something, as a child that, allowed a flowering of a kind of genetic predisposition towards mental illness. Also a brain, we now know that brain injuries lead towards impulsive behavior. I think of these sort of very famous NFL cases where there's a football player who's had repeated brain trauma and then goes and does something very violent. And that has also introduced a narrative, I think, into public life that people who kill are sort of made, not born. So you're starting to see it in other types of cases. It'll be a while, but I think that the work that's been done has created a context where judges, prosecutors, the public at large doesn't always, it's like the first impulse they have when they hear about a terrible crime isn't now always, what a monster, we should punish this person. It's, I wonder how that happened. And I think that more and more I'm seeing that shift, and it's showing up in the legal system, and then it's also showing up in public.
So you've described in detail what the defense bar brought to sort of push this shift along and to sort of advance our thinking on the issue. Have other system actors reacted as well? You mentioned prosecutors. Are you seeing evidence of a shift in their perspectives on how to approach whether or not to seek capital punishment in cases where it might be legally available?
Yes, absolutely. It started 10, 15 years ago when defense attorneys started winning big cases. I tell the story in the book of a dramatic case in Houston in 2008, where you had an undocumented immigrant named Juan Quintero who shot and killed a police officer, a decorated member of the force. And Mr. Quintero was had been deported after a conviction for a child sexual assault. He had then come back into the country. So this was the worst possible case in terms of how the public sort of views crime. Really, he had very little going for him in terms of public sympathy. His defense lawyer managed, even with that set of facts, to convince his jury to spare him. And that had a seismic effect on prosecutors who saw, oh, you know what, we might not automatically win. And these cases are a tremendous amount of work. They're tremendously expensive to bring. And so almost at a practical level, prosecutors started to reconsider. Fast forward 10 years, little by little, I would do these interviews with prosecutors where sometimes they wouldn't even admit that they felt mercy towards the defendant. They would say, I didn't feel like I could win that trial, and the jury would see that this was a damaged, broken person who really didn't, deserve the death penalty. And they wouldn't admit that they themselves were moved, but you could kind of tell, right? It was coming through in the way they talked about the case. Then on top of that, you have some prosecutors who more openly say it. And then you also have a shift in terms of a lot of big cities like Houston, like Philadelphia, used to have very punitive prosecutors. And in the past, 5 years or so have seen district attorney elections where the public has actually elected somebody who's running on a platform of rehabilitation, of turning away from the more punitive approach to the crime of the past. Sort of well-known prosecutors like Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, or Kim Ogg in Houston, or very recently George Gascon in San Francisco, who explicitly said, I will never seek the death penalty. That's what you're seeing in big liberal cities, but that is paving the way to where prosecutors in smaller cities, in rural areas, sort of have the political cover in individual cases to say, I'm not going to turn completely against the death penalty as a policy, but in this case, I'm not going to seek it. And again, like I said before, the death penalty isn't disappearing because we as a country are turning away from it necessarily. Polls still suggest that at least half, if not more, of Americans support the death penalty. But case by case, they're saying no to it, right? In any individual case, they're saying no. And at a certain point, that's all the cases. And we've sort of practically turned away from the death penalty, even if we haven't done it from a kind of moral, high-level policy place.
So I just want to remind the members of the audience that you are invited to submit questions in the question and answer box. And believe it or not, Maurice, we are just a few minutes away from the question.
Oh, yeah.
So I wanted to just turn back for a moment to your comment that there's still widespread polling support for the death penalty. And there are questions about whether or not we're going to be seeing large policy shifts going forward. But death penalty activists and advocates have definitely won successes in recent elections. You described the DA races and other things. Can you describe more about what we could do moving forward to eliminate the punishment?
Sure. I mean, President-elect Biden has said that he will support ending the federal death penalty and also incentivizing states to do the same. It remains to be seen what that means in terms of like what an incentive for a state would be. It might have to do with federal funding for law enforcement, for various kinds of criminal justice institutions. Democrats in Congress are also saying they're going to mount a major push to end the federal death penalty. This is being led by Ayanna Pressley. And I think over the next year, we're going to see that play out, and you're going to see a lot of calls among anti-death penalty advocates to contact Congresspeople, right, and push them to vote for such a bill. It'll be interesting to see on the right what this looks like, because many conservatives have turned against the death penalty, whether because of a moral idea about rehabilitation or whether fiscal conservatives because it's so expensive to carry out. So I think you're going to see that conversation happen. So I would say that over the next year, you're going to see, like I said, calls to Congresspeople, and then you're going to see, depending on where you live, the death penalty come up in district attorney races. So if you live in Philadelphia or Houston, you already have a district attorney who has committed to seeking the death penalty less often, if at all. But this movement of more progressive district attorneys, and I should say they're the ones who make the decision about whether to seek the death penalty in any particular case, you're going to see the issue, I think, come up in many more communities around the country. And then you might also see it come up in gubernatorial races, right? Like a lot of governors, Jared Polis in Colorado signed legislation to abolish the death penalty in Colorado this year. I think it'll be a while before southern states like Texas and Alabama and Mississippi, have governors running to abolish the death penalty. But little by little, you're actually seeing conservative lawmakers make it a part of their platform and actually get votes sort of based on it. And certainly in sort of more purple states, Florida, Ohio, you're seeing this debate play out at the level of the governorship. And I think that governors are going to be sort of more responsive to what the public says they want around the death penalty going forward.
So I'm going to start turning to the audience questions because we have a lot of them. Thank you all so much for submitting your questions. Several people have asked a question sort of following up on what we were just talking about, vis-a-vis whether or not it is likely that there will be an abolition of the death penalty at the federal level during the Biden-Harris administration. Do you have thoughts on that?
I do. I can't predict the future. I think that it's very likely that this congressional push to abolish the federal death penalty will get pretty far. And I think partially, the death penalty has, like we said before, has always been very symbolic. And that means that not having it ultimately is an easy lift. It might not be an easy lift politically because a lot of people still support it, but it's not like you need a really big machinery to implement the end of the death penalty like you would for the First Step Act, for example, or clemency, releasing large thousands of people from prison. I think that the Biden administration would be, just from a sort of politically, and Democrats more broadly, from a political tactical front, would be well served to make a lot of this because it sort of doesn't cost them a whole lot. Their base is very on board for abolishing the death penalty. Many conservatives are also on board. And it's sort of, I think it could be a kind of easy political win for them that also allows them to say, sort of stake a claim, like we're taking the country's criminal justice system in a new direction. And like I said, it won't affect that many cases. There's 50 people on death row and roughly at the federal level, and there's thousands and thousands of people in federal prisons. But it's sort of a symbolic way of saying to the country and to the world, we are turning away from punitive criminal justice policy. The lessons of the George Floyd protests and other sort of conversations about racial justice, we're taking them seriously, and we're doing something new to turn the criminal justice system in a new direction. And the other point I'd make about it is that I have heard people in the sort of foreign diplomacy community say that, ending the death penalty in America would be a way for Biden to signal to Europe that we're sort of recommitting to the shared human rights values that are a part of the relationship between the US and Europe and have been damaged under the Trump administration. I've heard among death penalty anti-death penalty advocates that they, kind of want leaders in Europe to go to Biden and say, you want to turn a new page and start and commit to human rights. Well, here's a quick, easy way that you can do it. You can sign a bill to abolish the federal death penalty in the United States.
Well, we shall see what happens at the federal level. In the meantime, there's a question in the chat about state law with regard to so-called felony murder statutes. And familiar with this particular case, but the questioner asks of a case like Charles Button, who did not actually kill anyone, but was sentenced to death because of the felony murder statute where he was convicted. Has there been progress in your research, if you've done this research, on the impact of felony murder statutes on the imposition of the death penalty, and whether or not states are making efforts to ensure that the ultimate punishment is reserved solely for those who actually did the murder?
Yeah, it's tricky, and I'll bring up a case. I don't know the case the asker mentions, but on Friday, tomorrow, the final execution of the Trump administration is a case of a man named Dustin Higgs. It's not precisely a felony murder case insofar as it wasn't sort of charged that way under state law, but it has the hallmarks. The argument the prosecutors made is that Mr. Higgs ordered someone else to commit murders, right? And that he's ultimately responsible for it, but he himself did not pull the trigger, and nobody believes that he did. And I think I don't have in front of me the full scope of which states have banned felony murder, but it's long been a kind of controversial aspect of the death penalty that I think has allowed opponents of the death penalty to sort of chip away at public support, especially among conservatives. I'm thinking of in Texas, there's a legislator named Jeff Leach, who's very conservative on many subjects, a Republican, who has led the charge in the Texas legislature to abolish what's called the law of parties. It's the Texas term for felony murder. And he is very troubled by cases in which the person being executed did not fire the shot, and in some cases played not even the role of ordering the deaths, something so small as being the getaway car driver when, a robbery went wrong, and had no idea that his co-defendants inside, the house or the store were going to kill anyone. You see a lot of cases like that. And I have seen politically and culturally these cases be a really key way that you sort of chip away at death penalty support and make the case, even to supporters of the death penalty, that the system has sort of failed to actually punish the worst of the worst, and that who gets the death penalty isn't the most culpable for these crimes, but rather the one who kind of got unlucky through the vagaries of the criminal justice system and the decision-making of prosecutors and judges.
Well, what you ended on there, sort of the vagaries of the system, raises another interesting point on whether or not the public can trust the government to get it right. Do you see a contradiction? This is an audience question. Do you see a contradiction between conservatives who, on the one hand, have a distrust of government and yet on the other hand embrace executions, or are you seeing some of that support get chipped away over time?
I think you definitely are seeing it get chipped away over time. And it's as conservatives sort of realize that supporting the death penalty does not comport with their stated ideals of distrusting the government and not giving the government power to do things like have power over life and death, right? So there have been some really smart scholars like Franklin Zimmering who have tried to understand how that contradiction came to be. They talk about how there was a kind of mythology that grew up around the death penalty where conservatives could see it not so much as the government coming in and carrying out executions, but rather local communities sort of doing a service to the victims' family members, right? This idea that the prosecutors are almost like police or nurses in that they are providing a service to the family members of victims and kind of carrying out the revenge basically that family members themselves would have sought. And this sort of, I go into this much more in the book, but it taps into these sort of old West ideas about kind of frontier justice and revenge that feel very dated when you kind of pick them apart and think about them in terms of our actual contemporary justice system. But over time, you are seeing conservatives come to see that contradiction and often fall on the side of, this is big government and we don't think it should happen anymore. One of the discoveries I made in the past few years is that there's a very prominent conservative commentator who appears on Fox News all the time named Michelle Malkin, who often supports the president, often goes on sort of Laura Ingraham and a lot of these other Fox News shows. And she wrote an op-ed that appeared in Oklahoma newspapers that said the death penalty is an abhorrent practice because we get it wrong. There's so many risks of innocent people being executed. It got to the point where she was writing things like, silence in this is complicity. These sort of like very, like you could tell that she's personally horrified by the death penalty, even as she maybe supports the president who supports it, right? And I think I took away from that if someone like that who sort of regularly goes on Fox News and supports the president has such strong feelings against the death penalty and feels like the system fails to get it right, particularly in the case of potentially innocent people being executed, it bodes sort of well for those who want to convince the conservative community in America to join liberals in abandoning the punishment.
Well, in that discussion, you touched upon the role of victims and sometimes the notion that district attorneys and others are sort of seeking to represent the victims. Mm-hmm. In your reporting, did you find that victims had a sort of monolithic or unified voice in this, or was there a lot of nuance to victims' perspectives?
There was a ton of nuance. So in the book, I tried to convey the diversity of opinion among victims. So on the one hand, I interviewed a woman who saw the man who had killed her siblings be executed. And she was one of 3 siblings, and a man had shot and killed both her brother and sister. And so she and her parents went to Huntsville to witness the execution. And she said it was an incredibly powerful and good experience because I saw my father in particular, who had lost his son and daughter, transform from a kind of shell of a man who was horrified and tortured by what had happened to his kids. I saw the weight kind of lift off him, and he suddenly was happy again and able to he talked more. It was like the quote she had was something like, there was a bowling ball attached to his neck that had been removed. So I wanted to include that because that's a narrative that cuts against, opponents of the death penalty and shows that for some reason, people that really did kind of provide a service. At the other extreme, you have people who were family members of victims of these really terrible murders and opposed the death penalty and felt like they were jerked around at every turn by prosecutors, by judges, by the prison system, and by journalists even, right, who basically said, I don't even want to interview you unless you comport to this very specific narrative I have about how a victim should react in such a case, right? And I found that basically there were as many ways to respond to having a family member murdered as there were people in that position. I mean, there was just incredible diversity. And as a result, you had some who supported the death penalty and many who opposed it, and many who felt like they were almost like a political pawn, right? In the current Trump executions, you actually have William Barr, the Attorney General, in press releases saying, we're doing this as a service to the victims. And then you have victims, like family members of the people themselves saying, this isn't being done for us. We've opposed the death penalty for years. And it kind of makes a mockery of our lives and the deaths of our loved ones to say that you're doing this in our name. I'm thinking specifically of the first of the federal executions of a man named Daniel Lewis Lee. The family members of the victim in that case were actually split. Some of them supported the death penalty, but many of them were very opposed and made that known publicly. And so it suggests that we can't see the death penalty as a service to victim family members in a monolithic way, because it really isn't.
Thank you for that. We are running very short on time, so I'm going to ask one more question from the chat. What are your thoughts on death penalty and sort of whether or not it impacts deterrence? Does it have any deterrent value based on your reporting?
No, is the simple answer. For decades, scholars have tried to draw some link between whether carrying out executions actually reduces crime in any meaningful way. And there have been some studies that purport to show that, but then a lot of criticism of those studies by other scholars. And so there is not really well accepted proof that it does such a thing. In fact, states that have the death penalty tend to also have higher murder rates in a broad sense. Sometimes you'll see policymakers say, this is proof that the death penalty doesn't work. And you'll have other policymakers who say, this is proof that we need it more, right? That we need the death penalty more because we have a higher murder rate. But I saw over and over again, policymakers try to kind of manipulate the figures, but the scholarly community it appears to sort of abandoned the effort really to show deterrence. And you even see that in many public statements of public officials who tend to talk less about deterrence these days and more just admit that the point is retribution and to punish someone, right, for what they did, as opposed to scare future people from doing those things.
And one final question. Mm-hmm. What average person do to get involved in affecting change on this issue? What would you recommend?
It's a very good question. I would pay attention to what's happening in Congress and at the federal level in terms of abolishing the death penalty. I would look and see whether your state has the death penalty. And if it does, look at what efforts are going on in your state legislature, either to abolish it or to curtail it. There have been these sort of efforts to, for example, abandon the death penalty for felony murder cases, like we discussed, or for cases of people with severe mental illness. There's a bill in Ohio, for example, if you live in Ohio, where the governor there is considering whether to sign such a bill to abolish the death penalty for those with mental illness. And then at the local level, I would find out who your district attorney is and find out whether they have pursued death sentences. You can do this by just sort of Googling and reading the news. Find out whether your district attorney has pursued death sentences. And if they have, write them letters and hold them accountable and really look into those cases.
Thank you so much, Maurice. Our thank you to Maurice Chammah of the Marshall Project for your research and your very excellent book. Thank you for spending this lunch hour with us here today. There's a link in the chat on how you can order Maurice's book. As I said, it is really a good read. It's called Let the Lord Sort Them, The Rise and Fall of the Death Penalty. Thank you, Maurice, for your work, your reporting, and your advocacy on this issue. Thank you also to New York University's John Bradamus Center for collaborating with us on this program. I am Taryn Merkel. Thank you for coming to this Brennan Center for Justice event.